Hello, 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 fellow humans.
Well, welcome to the Rise of Humanness Podcast, where we explore what it means to stay human in a world increasingly run by algorithms, bots, and machines. I'm Mike Schindler.
And I'm Chris Nolan.
And together, we're going to show you how to stay absolutely powerful,
Stay human.
and rise and thrive in the age of AI.
Yes, and even show you how to beat the bots. Well, let's rise.
The rise of humanness in the age of AI. It's a podcast with Chris and Mike. The rise of humanness in the age of AI. Stay curious, stay human, let's rise.
We're excited to have you on. We're excited to talk about the Management Lab. We're excited that, to hear your thoughts on where things are going. Chris and I love to be super casual about this. So if you want to go deep down a rabbit hole, totally fine.
Okay.
We'll pull you out of the rabbit hole.
Yeah, please.
Go too deep,
No,
right?
that's okay. I mean, you're brilliant. I've followed you for a long time. I think you're the top of your field in all this business school and management and leading. You're just a super thought leader. So
Yeah.
let's
Okay,
rock and roll,
ready?
Mike.
Okay, good. Well, hey guys, welcome to the Rise of Humanness Podcast with Chris and Mike. So excited about our guest today. I'm excited that we've got Professor Gary Hamel on the show. He is a true visionary. And I will tell you that if you have ever questioned like how your workplace operates, Gary has probably written the book that inspired that thought, literally.
Oh, absolutely. So Gary is a visiting professor at the London Business School and the director of the Management Lab, which essentially is a playground for blowing up outdated bureaucratic systems. The author of the groundbreaking book, Humanocracy, that's a blueprint for unleashing the human potential in every organization. Gary's on a mission to reinvent the workplace and harness what he calls collective genius.
Yeah, so I think it's just really important for us to think about Gary as kind of the workplace architect of the future. I think that's our audience really needs to know. He's a guy that's figured out that humans are better at being, and humans that operate as robots, that's not good. So, I mean, he's just really about like humans are beings. They're beings, not doings. They're not robots. So how do we lean into that? And that's what we're going to find out today on this show.
That's right. So welcome, Gary, to the Rise of Humanness Podcast.
Nice to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So let's dig in here. Let's dive in. So you talk about building an innovation advantage. To do that, you got to have a human advantage, which is why we think people are having such a difficulty integrating AI into the workplace. So the next thing you say is that organizations lack next generation capabilities. Once again, how does this apply to AI? And are we doing something with AI where we're saying, here's the lightsaber, become a Jedi Knight, without telling them why?
Well, I think there's some really interesting context there. First of all, if you step back for a moment, if you look at how much we've been spending on information technology in our companies and organizations around the world, at the moment, we're spending something around $4 trillion a year. AI is just going to push that number higher.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you look at productivity growth over the last 20, 30 years, it's declining. The rate of productivity growth is declining. So somehow all of this new technology is not really making our organizations kind of net more effective, because that would show up in productivity statistics. And in fact, we know that if you look at the largest companies in our economy, they are contributing less to productivity growth than they did 20 years ago. In fact, are now a drag on productivity growth. So I think as we think about, deploying new technologies, and AI most obviously now, there's two weaknesses that you typically find. First of all, most organizations are really slow in taking advantage of this. They may now move faster than AI than they have in the past, but typically they've been quite slow to take on new technologies. And number two, when we do deploy them, we tend to deploy them in ways that kind of create incremental advantage. It's about like doing what we're doing now a little bit better, a little bit faster, but we very seldom see the revolutionary potential in those technologies. So, a company, I don't know, pick a hotel company like Marriott that's looking at digital technology and says like, well, we can run our loyalty program this way. We can do online check-ins, reservations, and so on. But they never see the opportunity to do something like Airbnb. So I suspect that the same thing will be true with AI. And I think what really needs to change beyond having organizations that are kind of more proactive and more creative in how they use this is really understanding that these technologies should be ways of dramatically extending human capability, not simply replacing human capabilities, but amplifying human capability. One of the analogies that is super interesting for me, if you look at the explosion of social media, you look at you look at the 32 billion channels on YouTube where you can learn literally anything.
Yeah.
That human creativity was always there. I kind of piss off Gen Z and millennials when I tell them, by the way, you are not more creative than your grandparents were, not even a little bit. But what you had that they didn't have is you had all these tools of low-cost video creation, and you had new platforms with no gatekeepers where you could share this stuff.
Yeah.
And so you just see this explosion of human creativity. Well, what you haven't seen is that inside of our organizations, because we haven't equipped people with the new tools. We haven't given them the permission to create. There's still a whole lot of internal gatekeepers. We call that bureaucracy that prevents them from doing good work. So it is really the human factor that has prevented us from fully taking advantage of these new technologies. We'll see if AI is different, but I kind of doubt it. The guy that I respect a lot on this, Dean Acemoglu, who's a Nobel-winning economist at MIT, his prediction is that AI will raise our productivity by about 1%. There's a pretty modest impact. So, he might be wrong, but when I look back at history, that seems about right. Trillions of dollars. And yet, because we really haven't unleashed the human side of this.
Yes.
That is so interesting. Okay, so this is, Chris, now I'm going to go down the rabbit hole. You said something like it hasn't really increased productivity, but the media out there, all the things that are being promoted is this will create 40 to 70% efficiencies or 30 to 70% efficiencies, right? So if you implement this, to your point, a lot of people are using it. So you understand the workplace. How do we reinvent the workplace? I mean, we're going to have to, right? AI is here. It's a tool. So how do you see the workplace being reinvented with all this?
Well, I think, let me just finish off for a second on this productivity thing, and then let's talk about the workplace, because, for sure, some of these technologies are making us more productive. There's no doubt about that. Having said that, a lot of those productivity gains have been eaten up by increasing bureaucracy. And let me give you some data on that. If you go back to 1983, so what are we now? This is about 40 years back. If you look at since 1983, the number of managers and administrators in the U.S. workforce has grown by 150%, so more than double. All other job categories are up 45%. If you look in the federal government, right, we have a new administration, DOGE, and so on. If you look in the federal government, since 1998, we've added 250,000 new administrative jobs in the federal government, while the number of all other jobs, the scientists, the engineers, the first responders, has gone down by 18,000. So basically, all these productivity gains are being eaten up by this ever-expanding bureaucratic, administrative, managerial class, which, when I kind of like to argue that every organization will have as much bureaucracy as it can afford. And if you're the federal government, you can afford enough bureaucrats to block out the sun. You look at you look at Mark Zuckerberg at Meta at Facebook, he was recently complaining. Meta now has 8 or 9 management layers.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't think you want an organization where it's just managers managing the people who are doing the work. You're like, yeah, no, that's not a good idea, Mark. You got that one right. But a lot of CEOs don't know how to change this. And so I think it's not that these technologies don't give us productivity advantage, but often we don't use them in ways that really multiply human capability. And whatever productivity gains they are, disappear into this ever-expanding bureaucratic class, because if you're a bureaucrat and you're in a world with a lot of new problems, the solution to every new problem is more bureaucracy, right? You hire more bureaucrats, another CXO, more mandates, more rules, more policy, paralyzes the organization, and the people at the front lines are just so constrained. And the data says this. The Gallup data will tell you that only 1 in 5 employees believe their opinions matter at work. Only 1 in 8 say they can influence decisions. Only 1 in 11 say they can experiment with new tools, methods, solutions, and so on. So when you look at the data, you reach, I think, an arguable conclusion that most organizations are wasting more human capacity than they use. And until that changes, I don't think we're going to see big changes. We're not going to see that productivity growth thing turn around until we get way better at unleashing the ingenuity and the initiative of the people who work in our organizations. That's
That's very
the data
well,
says that. That's not me. That's the data.
yeah, that's it's like so true. I'm actually thinking to myself, I'm wondering if AI is going to actually increase those layers. That's the crazy part. I know exactly what you're saying. So I can remember back, we have a content company. We work with Google and Disney, places like that. But I was at one time brought in to be a consultant for Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge. And we had, I think, 6 layers. And we always had this joke that the first 4 were just meetings for meetings. And you didn't want to get that message where you got to talk to this guy here and he's number 6. You go, oh God, this is just a meeting for nothing. Next meeting's for nothing. Next meeting's for nothing. And really it's like the top guy, the CMO, really makes all the decisions anyway. These are all filters for him. So I'm wondering with AI, is that going to create more of this, maybe another layer, even of like the AI layer, got to go through that layer. And so this is to think about that. This is my question though, is like, how do we bust that? So if you're saying that you need to empower employees to have more autonomy and you've got that bureaucracy, are you saying that that's got to go first before we go?
Well, I think so. The kind of insight, and I have to admit, it came very slow to me, and only after I spent decades working with organizations all over the world. But I got super curious, like, why was I seeing the same disabilities, country after country, industry after industry? Whether it was Disney and whether it was Google and whether pick your company, but they were often slow to intercept what was new. They were seldom the authors of game-changing innovation. They might have done it once, but they very seldom did it 3 or 4 times. And you go like, okay, there's clearly something systemic here that's not about one leader, one company. So you dig deep into it and go, hey, all of these companies are basically running a management system, a management model that has its roots in the 19th century at a time when most employees were illiterate. And you needed like this new class of managers to tell them what to do, which would end up becoming kind of, an administrative aristocracy in most companies. But you needed these managers to tell them what to do. And because information was very expensive to move, the best way to do that was to build a hierarchy, 10 people report up, consolidate their information, report up again. Only the people at the top have the full picture, so they have all the decision rights because they're the only people who can see the whole thing. None of this is true anymore, right? Like administrative skills are just a commodity now. You can inform everybody about what's going on. People are highly educated, and yet we're still stuck with these 8 or 9 layers and, disempowering. And so we have to we got to change that. And, you guys are all in the media industry, and you look at, you look at how significantly that's changed over the last decade. I mean, it's literally all out of proportion, the media business model. We have to be ready to think just as radically about how we change the way we lead, manage, and organize. So one of the questions I ask CEOs today and others is, can you imagine if you take the kind of existing organizational model, 8 or 9 layers, power's concentrated at the top, pay calibrates with rank, not value added, but rank, power trickles down, big leaders appoint little leaders, powerful staff groups enforce compliance, ranks of middle managers set goals, and so on. Employees compete for the scarce resource of promotion. If you take that whole thing, can you imagine an alternative that is as different from that bureaucratic status quo as YouTube, Instagram, and whatever are different from mainstream media, as Airbnb is different from Marriott, as cloud computing is different from whatever came before, as AI is different from Google search? And most leaders struggle, right? They're so much prisoners of the status quo that even though they see around them all this radical innovation in products and services and business models, it's hard for them to imagine that the organization itself could change as radically. But we have to be able to imagine that. And the good news is there's a bunch of examples of organizations that are doing this. So it's not like, you don't have any models to look at, but most of us are still stuck just assuming this is the only way you run an organization, that old way.
Yeah.
So that has to change. It's a pretty fundamental change.
Google and Disney actually are better at it.
Well, they're getting there. And what's so crazy about this is we do have the models. I mean, you think about, I'm going to go back and pull from the military side, so some of the military guy here, but we won World War II with like 4 4-star generals, right? that was World War II. Yet now we got like 40 4-star generals. So to your point, we've layered upon layered upon layered, and we've taken away the creativity, we've put in all these SOPs. We have not really tapped the human value. And I think that's something that, Schern talks about this. They talk about taking this closed system of humans, right? Because we're kind of a closed system, and this closed system of AI to achieve ROI. But what we're seeing organizations do, to your point, is just pump in tools, and nobody's teaching anybody how to communicate with each other. So how do we, I mean, you're the expert in this. How do we take these two closed systems and teach them how to maximize and prioritize? How do we do this? I mean, is there a golden?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I have a point of view on that, but let me react to a couple of things you said. First of all, let's go back to government for a moment, because, we have a new administration and everybody's talking about this. You're absolutely right. If you go back to World War II, Admiral Nimitz ran the Pacific Theater with 100 staffers. Now you find 3,000 staffers running the Pacific part of the military command. There are now more U.S. generals. There are more generals, 4-star generals, responsible for finance, accounting, HR than there are for warfighting units.
Yeah.
And inside the U.S. Army, if you look at the ratio of war fighters to bureaucrats, all right now there's 4 war fighters for every bureaucrat. 20 years ago, there were 8 war fighters for every bureaucrat, right? So, you see this in business, and you see it in military and government and so on. So I think the first thing we have to do is we just have to stop that. Like we have to start recognizing the cost, both the economic and the social cost, of how paralyzed our organizations are by just too many rules, too many people who can say no, too many layers, decision cycles super slow, too many people who are, more interested in protecting their career than building something new. So, and that's going to take measurement, right? I mean, leaders tend to pay attention to things that can measure. And while some of the costs of bureaucracy are visible, like, you have too many layers or too many staffers, a lot of the costs in terms of conservatism, being backward looking, being insular, disempowering people, those things do not show up directly on the P&L. They show up indirectly because you miss new opportunities. I mean, you think right now where we are really worried as a country about our declining capacity, relative capacity in chips and semiconductors. This is all due to a series of really boneheaded short-term decisions made at Intel and other companies. Intel missed every single opportunity for 20 years. Every single opportunity for communication chips, for low-cost, low-power chips that went into mobile devices, building foundries that would make chips, as you see it now in Taiwan, TSMC, the largest chip maker in the world, which is worth, 7 or 8 times what Intel is worth. So, these are not abstract problems. These are problems that cost us in military preparedness, in our competitive advantage in the world. So, your question is, where do you start? Well, I think first you start with motivation. You have to start by let's start looking at these costs and being serious about them. So we built something called the BMI, the Bureaucracy Mass Index. And we've had thousands of organizations look at that, which starts to give a real number, and you can kind of benchmark yourself and say, okay, this number is going up, we got to turn it around, and we need to hold every leader accountable for kind of reducing that, number one. And, and I think that needs to be the real work of DOGE. It's not just making government smaller, that's part of it, but you got to just make it better. Secondly, if you're a leader, once you can measure this stuff, you have to look for models. As I said, most of us grew up in and around organizations that fit that old template. And you were saying, Chris, about standing in these meetings where nobody can make a decision. It's the pre-meeting for the next meeting for the next meeting, and so on.
Exactly.
And we just assume that's the way an organization has to run. And to be fair, most leaders have never seen an alternative. So it's a little bit like asking somebody at NBC Universal in 2004 or 5 to imagine streaming, right? I mean, they would have struggled to do it. But the good news is we now have some models. I think of a company that I worked with very closely. I was their chief transformation officer, Hire, the largest appliance maker in the world. Yeah, who runs a 50,000 person organization with 3 levels, and they've divided this big company into 4,000 micro enterprises, where every little micro enterprise has its own P&L and is very entrepreneurial, and they collaborate together on big. I won't unpack all of this. Or I look at the largest provider of home health care in the Netherlands, an amazing company called Birdzorg, one of the most watched healthcare companies in the world that has 10,000 nurses delivering service and no managers at all. So first you have to have the motivation, but second, you got to recognize there's some really different ways of doing this. Like, don't think that there's only one model. I think thirdly, we're going to need a pretty big mindset change. A lot of leaders still see themselves as like, I'm the decision maker in chief, I'm the big strategist. And, given the complexity and the speed of change in the world, I don't care how smart you are at the top of the company, you are not smart enough to direct that company and decide where it needs to go next. That has to come from a very open process where you're exploiting a lot of ideas, finding the best of those. So we have to get leaders to think about themselves not as these great generals and so on, but kind of more as architects of, hey, how do I build an organization that is more daring, that is more dynamic, that is more resilient, that is more creative? How do I engage people in doing that? So there's kind of a big mindset change in how we think about leaders. And then finally, you've got to get from here, here to there. You have to make this transition, which means ultimately probably changing just how we plan, how we allocate resources, how we hire, how we promote. And we can go a little deeper if you want, but I'll finish here. I think the way we're going to do that and how we're trying to help companies do that, it's not some big top-down change program. It's not like we're going to blow everything up and start over again. It's not practical. But what you have to say is we just need to be trying more new things. We need to be experimenting on more things across the organization. So maybe here's a different way of allocating. Well, like, why don't we do an experiment with crowdfunding and see whether the crowd has a different idea of where we should be putting our money? Maybe there's a different way of compensating. Let's see if we can get a way of compensating people that's really tied to value, pure attested value added rather than where they sit in the rank. So, if you look at how complex systems like life itself evolves, it's not like some big grand redesign every few years. It's just constant experimentation.
Yeah.
So I think that, the companies, the organizations that win going forward are simply going to be the ones that experiment more systematically, more consistently with, hey, what can we do that helps people bring more of their best to work? How do we reduce the barriers that disincentivize them? How do we create an organization where everybody feels like owners? So I think it's going to be the pace of experimentation, and the companies that are doing this faster are going to win, and the companies that are stuck in that old model aren't. But it's not just about blowing things up because, or trying to do some grand redesign, because that's very risky, probably doesn't work. But it is about giving the organization the permission to experiment, taking the best of those things. And, if I look at how Hire, some of these other like amazing post-bureaucratic companies have built their models, it wasn't a CEO with some grand vision. But what you did have, and it's very interesting, in every case, what you had was a leader, Jos de Block at Birdzorg, or Zhang Rumin at Hire, or Ken Iverson at Nucor. You had a leader who said, rather than building a management system that's designed to maximize control for the sake of efficiency, let's see if we can build something that maximizes contribution for the sake of impact. And then you start with that goal and you work backwards and say, like, if we were really serious about this, what will we change? And piece by piece, bit by bit. And there's contemporary examples. Roche, the second largest pharmaceutical company in the world, just went through this over the last 4 years. Unbelievable transformation. So it's possible, it's doable, but it really starts by being serious about a new problem, right? Because so much of what you find in organizations was just built to control on the assumption that people are idiots. They're going to cheat the system. They're not very smart. And, our job is to make sure they never screw up. Okay, fine. You can do that. You lock the organization in cement. You have no initiative, no whatever. But, we got to turn that around and say, no. We really have to figure out a way to unleash this human capacity. The tools can help. But if you start with an assumption that, all of the intelligence and all the brain power is at the top, and that's how our companies are run, they're run like a caste system where the thinkers and the doers. If that's your mental model as a leader, you're kind of lost today, I would say.
Didn't Google used to do this, Chris? I mean, remember they had the 70, 20, 10 philosophy, right? Where they're like 70% is, your day-to-day work stuff. And then, you did 20%.
Well, that's why I said Google's
Yeah,
a little bit more hip to this, but nowhere near like Hire any of those kind of companies. They still have layers. The thing that we're finding, and we're exactly similar things where you have people that are completely disengaged, and it's always that they're too negative, and and they don't get very much autonomy. In fact, they think if they're going to get an extra day with AI, they're going to spend it playing video games.
Right.
I don't have any real faith in them, you know. So here's an interesting question. I think so. As AI democratizes employees, so you have this tool that has this ability to kind of bring everybody up to an 80% expertise threshold, not just in their specifics field, but general. Like, if you're in marketing, you could do a search of what a contract is. I can do it on ChatGPT. If you're in the legal department, you want to make a brochure, you can go do it. You don't have to even go to the marketing department. So you've got this democratization happening with AI, which definitely impacts what you're talking about. If you have more and more and more of that, does that force the companies now to go, well, we need to be more decentralized? What do you think about that?
I have to say, it's a hard prediction to make. It's definitely going to have an enormous impact. I wrote 25 years ago, I wrote the first cover story for Fortune magazine, which at that point was an important magazine. I wrote their first cover story on the internet. And I think kind of the last sentence in that, I said, the internet is not a new advertising, new industrial order. And I think that's kind of how it turned out to be. I think AI is going to have similar impact. Like, hard to see right now, but it is going to create entire new industries. It's going to change old industries and so on. Having said that, how optimistic am I that, incumbent organizations are really going to use this in a creative way? I'm not very optimistic. Just when I look back and see history, right? It's not that I don't have a crystal ball, but when I look at every tech, the people who say like, this is going to be so transformative. Well, let's look back at the last 40 years where we had mainframe computers, personal computers, mobile phones, cloud computing, the internet, e-commerce, big data, business analytics. Like, this is like a long, long list of technologies. Did that make our companies fundamentally more capable? No. Like, the data says no. Well, unequivocally, the data says no. So, or I just look at, because we're kind of talking about the future work. I look at all the things we've done over 20, 30 years around work, right? High performance work teams, mindfulness training, agile teams, psychological safety. There's this long list. And has it made a difference? I don't think so. Because I think at the core of it, there's something that we call architectural innovation, which means, at some point you pull things back down to the studs and you go like, it's not about adding a new room or a new sink. You gotta just rebuild this house. And I think that's kind of where we are in business. So we keep, we have this kind of top heavy, highly stratified, disempowering, bureaucratic, rule driven system. And we keep trying to add things onto that. Like we're trying to graft these new things onto that old bureaucratic rootstock. And we wonder why, does there any fruit? Or to take another analogy, it's like putting a tutu on a dog and hoping it's going to become a ballerina. And you just end up with a stupid looking dog, right? Because the dog has quadruped DNA. Like, it does not have biped. And so I think the limits of these tools are primarily governed by the architecture that underlies them, the organizational architecture. And if that is old and out of date and centralized, so if you look at a lot of these new IT tools over the last 20 years, most of them have been used to move power to the center. They haven't been used to. I mean, let me give an example. Yeah. We now know, we have collaborative innovation tools that make it super, super easy. And we've done this in some organizations, but make it super easy to involve thousands of people in crowdsourcing strategy, right? What are where could we go next? What are the capabilities we could leverage? What do you see changing in the environment? What are your ideas? Where you could very quickly build out hundreds of new strategic options, use the crowd to kind of evaluate the best of those and so on. And by the way, the companies that have done this, it's hugely successful. And you don't miss the future, and so on. Having said that, almost no companies have done this. Why? Because the CEO would have to give up their monopoly as we're the ones that set strategy. You got to say guys, we don't know what's coming next. We need your help. Let's let's harness the wisdom of all of us. So I think, and so, yeah, but your point is absolutely right. I think what AI is going to do, the internet made information accessible. AI is going to make knowledge accessible.
Yeah.
And not merely information, and allow you to make it very context specific to whatever you're trying to do. One of the implications of that is that I think in the future, it is going to be impossible for any human being to know more than the system, right? I mean, there's just like, it's all there. Anybody can, there's no, it's almost impossible to be the expert, right? Because the expertise is going to be there.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
the value is going to come not from knowing more, but from knowing different. And that means you have to be a contrarian. AI is not very good at that, right? It will tell you it's already there, whatever. But what it can't tell you is, it can't help you challenge the status quo. And so, if you look at innovation, that is the heart of all innovation. It's challenging conventional wisdom, what people already believe, coming up with something that's fundamentally new and different. And so I think, and solving new problems. AI can give you all the information you need. It is not going to solve a new problem, right? But it's not going to help us make the transition from chemical batteries to solid state batteries, which we need to do in the thing. That's going to be human ingenuity. So I think, like all of these, back to the example of, people being able to use these new digital tools, and we get Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and so on. If we put these tools in people's hands and we create organizations where we're asking them to innovate and so on, we're going to see incredible things. But that has not been history, right? I mean, take something as simple as this. I meet a lot of CEOs who tell me they're serious about innovation because they all know it's important. And so I say, okay, you're telling me you're serious. Do you mind if I test that, like empirically? Can I talk to people? So I go down to people on the front lines and I ask them 3 questions. Has the organization trained you to think like a business innovator? Have they invested in your creative capacity? No. Okay. If you have an idea, back to your point, Michael, about Google, when they used to be like 20%, whatever. If you have an idea and you need 20% of your time and a few $1,000s to experiment, is that super easy to get? Is there a way of doing it that will happen in a few hours or a day or two, or would you not even know where to start? And then the third question is it clear that your boss is accountable for innovation? Are there metrics? Are you tracking number of ideas, quality of ideas, and so on? Does it influence their compensation? Well, you might imagine when I ask those questions, have you been trained? Is it easy to experiment? It's no, and no. So I have to go back to the CEO and say, hey, now you were telling me you were serious about this, but you haven't trained people, you don't make it easy, and you don't hold people accountable. Yeah. So clearly you have a different definition of serious than like I have. So I'm curious what that might be, right?
Did they escort you out the door after that conversation?
I don't know. Let's get invited back.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, Gary. Goodbye.
Yeah. I've been fan out of some really good places, but not always. I mean, there are organizations that are really putting these ideas to work and doing extraordinary things. So, but that's what I'm saying. It is not so much the tool, it's the context in which that tool is used.
See,
a medium or a new distribution channel is the foundation for an
every guest, I swear, confirms that we've got to build Captain Kirk University.
I know, I just wrote that down, but you mentioned the 80%, which is that blended democratization, but the 20%, or let's say the 1% at the top. And we had a guest that had a breakthrough. He says, wait a second, the top execs actually have to have a level of expertise to override AI. Basically, they have to know enough to go, I'm Captain Kirk. Thank you, ship's computer, right? Mm-hmm. But I have a hunch this works. Right.
Yeah. It's kind of bizarre that if you think about it, in most organizations, we've concentrated the responsibility for setting strategy and direction at the top.
Yeah.
And yet, if you ask the question, who in the organization is most likely to have their emotional equity invested in the past? Who in the organization is going to feel compelled to defend decisions that were taken a decade ago? Who in the organization is farthest away from the bleeding edge of change, technology, customers, and so on? It's the people at the top.
Yeah.
And so, my experience is that typically, or let me say it differently, the risk of that system, when an organization is waiting for permission to change or do something new, waiting for permission from the top, what you end up with is that an organization's capacity to change is often held hostage by the willingness of a handful of people to write off their own depreciating intellectual capital.
Wow.
And that was true at Intel, it's true at Disney, it was true at Motorola, it's true at General Motors, it's just like true down the line. And so, that's why I would argue that, at the top, you need to think about, here's an analogy, maybe a bad one. I think about Jimmy Wales, who created Wikipedia. He did not say I'm the smartest guy in the world. He did not say I'm going to write the encyclopedia. He said, let me build a collaborative infrastructure with the incentives and the platform, the encouragement for people to come and contribute their knowledge. And I think that's the way a CEO needs to think, right? How do I build the incentives, the system, or whatever? So, for example, when I first met Zhang Rumin at Hired, this is now 11 or 12 years ago, first conversation when he came to see me in my office in California, he said, I want to build a company where everybody is their own CEO.
Love that.
Because people are not a means to an end, they're an end in themselves.
Yeah.
I never heard a CEO say that.
Yeah.
Like he said, what I really want is a company that is a platform for entrepreneurship. And so if you start with that goal, you end up with a very different sort of organization.
Yeah.
If you start with the status quo and you go, let me build here, change here, you end up with more of the same.
Man, you got to put ego aside to be able to do that though, right? Because I mean, we've created a system where it's power, control, predictability, right? These are all failure mechanisms, right? These are crutches. Like to your point, Intel's getting left behind because they wanted predictability, they wanted control. They wanted these things in order, but that doesn't allow you to be creative. It reminds me of this book, Turn This Ship Around by Captain David.
Yeah. Good book. Super good book.
Great book. Same principle that he used in the military, which is, wait a second, why am I going to make decisions when the chief engineer is the expert in this arena? I need to tap his or her knowledge, right, to go ahead and turn this thing around. And I think that's what you're talking about is how do we get people to really embrace that? So I know there's ethical implications in using AI. I know that there's, we talk about the tools, but you're talking more about trust and self. So if I'm understanding you correctly, companies really, the tools are the tools. They're going to change. We got agentics that's coming on the market. Oh my gosh, now next, 2026 is going to be something different, right? So is the advice, if I was starting a company, what would your advice be to me, Gary? Would it be, listen, Mike, you need to, don't worry about the tools. You need to be aware of the tools. You can incorporate some of these tools, but you need to find the right people and you need to invest in those right people and give them the freedom to be creators, not robots. Is that what I hear you saying?
Certainly that's part of it. I mean, that's the philosophy behind it. I mean, in the end, you still need an organization that has the systems, the structures and so on, to grow and to run and so on. It's not letting everybody do their own thing, right? And I think, historically we saw this trade-off, and I can't remember which great academic kind of came up with this framework. It's a very simple one, but it's the trade-off between explore and exploit. So startups are really good at exploring the future, what's going on, let's do something new. And large companies tend to be very good at exploiting existing advantages and scaling up. And we've historically assumed that it's one or the other. Like you either have the startups or you have the big companies, but a larger company cannot be good at both. And so you see, as I mentioned, you see a startup like Facebook, which starts out, very ambitious, or Google, right? I wrote a piece probably 15 years ago for the Wall Street Journal, on Google's amazing management. That's all gone now at Google, right? It doesn't exist anymore. Bureaucracy just overtook it.
Right.
So I think that the trick in building a company is to say, hey, I need the discipline, I need the systems, I need the structures. Is there another way to get it? And what you see in some of these vanguard companies that I write about in Humanocracy, it's true now at Hire, it's true at Roche, it's true at a big French infrastructure company, Vinci, it's true at Handelsbanken, the most successful bank in Europe and so on. What you see is that they have figured out how you buy the benefits of bureaucracy, how I get the control, the consistency, the coordination, but how do I buy that duty free, right?
Yeah.
How do I get that without? So let me give a simple, for instance, at this company Birdzorg, which, as I said, employs about 10,000 nurses delivering home care in the Netherlands. They've organized 10,000 nurses into teams of 12. And you find this across all these companies. The very small teams are the unit of analysis. Each of those little teams of 12 nurses is responsible for finding their office space, hiring colleagues, finding patients, building a client list, liaising with local medical professionals, and so on. And there are literally almost no top-down mandates or standards at all in that organization. What you do find, though, is every one of those teams is responsible for patient care and for their efficiency, and their performance is visible. So about 1,000 of these teams, their performance is visible to every other team. So there's no place for mediocrity to hide. Yep. So the control does not come from layers of managers. The control comes from transparency. Everybody can see what you're doing. If you're screwing up, if you're the bottom of the league table, you have to change. And so there's a way of getting, in that case, discipline without having a lot of standards and a lot of layers. And, and part of the secret is making everybody truly accountable to the customer, right? And I learned that lesson early in my career when I was a very young professor at the London Business School. I was teaching my first class. I was teaching a class in strategy, and there was another new professor teaching the same class, a different section. And after 3 weeks, the students in this other section went to the dean and said, "This guy's not doing a very good job," and the guy was fired. And it became super clear to me, I am not reporting to the dean or to my department head. I'm reporting to my students,
Yeah.
And at the end of the term, they're all going to rate my performance. Everybody can see it. Like, nobody's telling me how to teach the class. There's no particular standards, but I better figure it out. And if I don't do well. And I think, what's happened in so many organizations, people are mostly responsible to other bureaucrats. Like, they're not responsible to end customers. At Hire, they took every internal function like HR and IT and so on, and they divided them into these little micro enterprises and said, you have to sell your services to other parts of this business. And if you don't, you're going to go out of business. But like, there's not a monopoly, right? If you're not doing things that are valuable, and it's kind of funny to me because I'll often, I'm talking to these corporate staff people, they'll often talk about their internal customers, and I go like, real customers, huh? Can they fire you?
Yeah.
No. Okay, so let's be clear. Let's use the right word. They're hostages, right? Let's be honest. And then we can figure out, but they're not customers. So in other words, it's not just about, hey, let's let everybody do their own thing. I still need the discipline. I still need the control. I still need the accountability. But there are ways of getting that you don't end up with stasis and there's enormous waste of time where people are simply feeding the beast, but where where the goal is that people get ahead by, adding value, not by kissing ass and climbing the ladder, right? So,
but that's the incentive.
Then I get a corner office, right?
That's the incentive we've created, though.
It is exactly. Exactly. So I look at bureaucracy as kind of this massive multiplayer game, which people play. To your point, Michael, people play it for the stakes of positional power and all of the perquisites that come with that. So if you learn to play that game well, you develop a certain set of behaviors. You learn how to deflect blame. You learn how to embroider data. You learn how to hoard resources, how to defend your turf, and most of all, how to manage up, right? How to keep whoever this person is happy, whether they're asking you to do the right thing or not, but just to, like, make them happy. The problem is none of those behaviors correlate with value added. It's like this game that we're all playing, which takes enormous time and energy and whatever, but is not really focused on doing the right thing for customers and making a difference in the world.
So it's innovation.
Yeah.
So often, in our work, one of the first things we do is like we do detox for bureaucrats, and we literally what's the fourth step in AA? Something like do a fearless moral inventory. How much of your time and really forcing people to think about, hey, crap, yeah, I'm managing out of that old model. And it really doesn't serve me well. I'm exhausted all the time and I'm on edge. It's kind of making me an asshole. And is there a better way there? Because, bureaucracy does not advance absent human attention. And at least one of the starting points is you have to have people go okay, I'm not going to play that game anymore. I want to make a difference. I want to do the right thing. I want to be a leader, not an administrator. So I have to give up a lot of those old habits and go to my team and say, hey guys, if you find me falling back into those old habits, if I'm hoarding authority when I should be letting you, run with things, if you see me kind of defending stupid policies, and we all know they're stupid, if you see me kind of nodding to some dumb idea coming down, hold me accountable. Say, hey, Gary, no, you don't want to be that guy. So that's certainly one of the things that has to happen. You got to, the people who've devoted themselves to playing the game, and it's not an easy thing to do, but you got to say, no, I don't want to play anymore.
I mean, that's the bottom line. We got to teach them how to be humans, not robots.
Mike and I, when we go into companies, we have this kind of teams to teams approach, which is McChrystal, everybody is a hero. We call it hierarchies versus hierarchies.
Love it.
But to your point, I do think that they love that. Oh yeah, I love it. But we don't know how well it's implemented. Usually we leave and maybe they probably go back to the same players that they had.
Yeah, Thursday, Friday, it goes great.
The thing that's striking me so interesting about what you're saying, especially about the customer. So one of the things that we do in our Rise of Humanness is when we go in, because we talk about here's the tools, but we actually go in right away saying that first we have to foster a human-centric workplace, you know? And that's interesting because you just added a layer to it, not just a human-centric workplace where everybody is a hero, but where we think about the end game to the goal line, the customer. That's also human-centric, which is not incorporated. But my question is, so the big talk, the big thing today is human-centric AI. So it seems for me what you're saying is what we need to do first is go in and look at what's human-centric in the workplace before we talk about human-centric AI. Otherwise, it's like we've got this rocket engine, but we're putting it on a horse, horse-drawn bug.
Yeah, I think there are different problems. I think, figuring out how we use AI in a humane way and in a powerful way is a super important one. But I think there's a preceding problem, which is we just have to change, the architecture of how organizations are run. And, it's a kind of a two-level problem. As we were talking a minute ago, there's an individual level to this, right? As an individual, I have to say, I need to show up differently at work, right? As a leader, I need to support the dissidents in the organization rather than shut them out. I need to, I need to sit in every meeting and be willing to say, where was I wrong? Or where might I be blind? Or what are we not thinking about? I need to be looking for the natural leaders in my organization that may be 4 levels down that are doing something extraordinary. And I need to amplify them. I need to be spending 20 or 30% of my time mentoring teams working on new ideas, right? There's a whole set of things that I have to do as a leader to build this kind of organization culture. Having said that, and I think one of you said this earlier, I can have all of those attributes, but if I'm inside of a system that doesn't reward those things, it's not going to last very long. I kind of gave up, not quite, I kind of gave up on doing executive education and leadership development because I'd get these people all fired up and hopefully a little bit enlightened. And then you go back into a workforce where none of what I taught them is relevant, right? None of those behaviors get rewarded. They get rewarded for sucking up and being a hard ass and whatever. And you go, so you definitely need this individual change, but you also have to change every system, every structure, every process inside. So you need the institutional change as well. And that's where a lot of organizations have not yet done that hard work. I mean, let me give you a really practical example. And this is kind of the level of granularity and also the level of innovation. So what you guys would know is that, in most organizations, if you have multiple product lines, divisions, so on, the people running those are all fighting for their budgets. Yeah. And it's super hard to move money into the new things, right? So what Roche did, which I thought was quite brilliant. So they're organized, their businesses are people run big therapeutic drug classes for oncology and heart disease and so on. So they said, we're going to have one budget. And here's what's going to happen. Every month, we're going to bring all of our business heads together. And you're going to have to tell your colleagues, what's the opportunity you have in front of you? How fast can you grow? What difference is this going to make to our total bottom line? And how are you using the resources? And then as a team, we're going to decide whether that's the best place to put the resources or not. And if it's not, we're going to move them somewhere else as a team. Because my goal is not to fight my little corner. My goal is, how do I maximize the success of Roche? As a team, that is all of our goal, right? We got to be not parochial and here. So what we're going to do is we're very quickly going to move people and resources behind the biggest opportunity rather than have an endless bun fight of people trying to protect their little part of the empire. So they move from these highly fragmented, highly politicized to one budget. And where every month we are dynamically redeploying our resources to wherever they earn the highest marginal return, and nobody gets to hoard resources. We can look and say, hey, you have $500,000 sitting there that you're going to spend on this. There's no evidence that's what we think it's better spent over here. So that is that's a change in a process. That's a hard change in how decisions get made, who's in the room, what data you're looking at. And there are dozens of things that are going to have to change like that if you want to create an organization that forever outruns change, that harnesses all this innovation capability and so on. And so, that's kind of hard work, thinking through every one of those systems and structures, what's the alternative? How will we do this in a better way? And, when we do this work, we're engaging thousands of people in that conversation. Guys, is there a better way here? What aren't we thinking about? Because that's not going to be architected top down, but what you can create is a conversation where you say, guys, the old model of us all fighting over resources and taking so much time to move resources in new directions, like we're missing opportunities. So yeah, you have to be willing to do that hard work of changing how the institution is wired, how decisions get made, who's in the room. And, otherwise it's a very interesting intellectual conversation about, how I need to be different, or wouldn't it be great if we all like took human beings seriously? But, if that's not backed up by system structures, processes, metrics, it's just, ethereal.
Oh, I almost want to go down the rabbit hole, because what you were talking about is so fascinating, because, you're really asking a company to be very transparent with you,
Well, with their
I mean,
people.
and everything.
Yeah.
We've had this happen, Mike and I, where we go in and they go, "Ooh," right? Because
Yeah. Well, no, we don't talk about that.
we don't talk about
Yeah,
that.
we don't talk about
Exactly.
that. No, that
Well,
stays.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think a lot of, you were saying something earlier about the team of teams thing, and that's a super important piece of work there. Because one of the ways to think about all of this at the core is we're trying to build organizations that are far more lateral and far less vertical,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Where control comes from peer accountability, not from boss accountability. Where coordination happens through collaboration rather than centralization, right? So building a much more, which is, by the way our world is moving, the way the world is working, and so on. But, that's a little bit threatening if you've made your career by exercising, power over people. And I think a lot of leaders are a little nervous, and I understand why, that if you open up some of these problems and conversations, the whole organization, you may hear things you don't want to hear. Now, the thing is, people are already having those conversations. The fact that you haven't made them legitimate, and said, guys, what are we missing? Where are we screwing up? What are your ideas? The fact that you haven't opened up, where's our organization not working? Where's bureaucracy running amok? The fact that you haven't opened that up and gotten the best thinking doesn't mean that people are not talking about it. They're just not talking about it with you.
Oh, it's
And,
having the hard conversations. That's what you're talking about, Gary.
Yeah, it's really hard. Mike, I want to ask one question. I really want to get Gary's opinion on this. So agentic AI is really good at, replacing whole teams. Like, let's say the accounting team, whoop, gone, agentic AI now. So what's your opinion on the fact that these companies are all excited to let's get agentic AI because we can have just one guy managing the legal department. He's got an agentic AI accounting department, but then we keep the 10 layers at top,
well, that's been the history. Let's outsource, let's offshore, let's automate, but somehow, my experience is managers are fans of everything lean except lean management, right? That's kind of been my experience. And so, the bureaucratic class, I don't really think it's a class thing, but I'll say that for shorthand, kind of takes care of itself. I mean, that's you just have to come to that conclusion when you see, the data I gave you earlier about just, the growth of jobs. By the way, it's also worth remembering that despite all of the technology over the last 50 years, if you look at all the job categories in the United States, there's only one that's disappeared. And that is an elevator operator, a lift operator is the only one that's really disappeared. So, all these predictions about, let me give an analogy. So when, this shows when we first had PCs, word processors or whatever, there was a prediction that it was true that the typing pool would disappear. Right. So some people, happens less great. There were like lots of people just spent their whole days a secretarial pool who was typing it out. Okay. So that disappeared. True. Let's ask the question. Are there more or less keystrokes per capita in the average organization today than there were 20 years ago? Right? Everybody. Yeah. And then we said, hey, this is great. It's, and then email is going to make this is there more? So we're going to have a lot of knowledge spam. We're going to have we're going to be buried under AI spam of one sort or another. So I think it's always easy to look at this kind of very optimistically, which we should, but also recognize, hey, it's probably not, and the best people, it's, because the average job is a very complex amalgam of a lot of different things. AI will influence some of that, not all of that. So history just says be a little bit skeptical about it, if you like. At the same time, really embracing it and working hard to understand it, but just be a little bit a little bit
I love
skeptical.
this. I love this line from, you remember Blazing Saddles with Mel Brooks?
Mhm.
You know, I think it was Harvey Korman asked Mel Brooks, he says, so why are we doing this? He says, because we have to protect our phony baloney jobs.
Chris, that's a great way. That's a great way to wrap it up. So, okay,
Yeah.
so before we let you go, because this is so good, we could go for hours on this. I
Yeah.
had this is another guest where I'm just enthralled. Like I could
I'll
sit
have
with
Gary
Cass,
back. If you, yeah, you
and
got to come back.
yeah, we should
I think we
Happy
just
to.
scratch the surface of this.
yeah,
Happy to.
totally. So if you could give one piece of advice to, our audience, to leaders, to people who are running companies, advice that takes them out of survival mode, but helps them really thrive in kind of this AI world, what would that be? What would that one piece of advice be?
Make sure you are spending enough time to really understand where the future's coming from and how. So often we kind of mistake the edge of the rut for the horizon, and you really have to get above that. And I would also say, try to have a first person experience, right? Don't read about AI, don't read about what's changing. Go out, use the tools, experiment with it, try it, talk to the companies that are leading it, because it's easy to dismiss things if it's only an intellectual understanding. You got to have a first person experience with the future. And that means taking the time and putting yourself in places where you have the chance to be surprised by all of this and be inspired by it. So, yeah, this just like take the
Yeah.
time to put yourself in the future.
There's our highlight reel. Let me just ask one little tiny thing on top of that, Mike, which is, so you do that, you get good at AI, you see the future, you're going to save maybe a day or two of work. Do you then visualize how you fill that? Because I think that's the big thing you're talking about. When you get autonomy, you go, okay, I'm going to save a day of work with this. Do you then, because you know how people are at work, they go to work, they look at the screen, they say, is it 5 o'clock yet? They don't really think, okay, I'm going to save a day. What do I do with that day?
Yeah.
Is that also looking into the future?
Yeah, I think of how much time all these tools have already saved me, in my
Yeah.
work and my writing and my research, how quickly I can go understand something and get it and perfectly. And for me, that's just a huge force multiplier.
Yeah.
That means I can spend more time trying to think of something new and try to create and try to invent and so on. It's not like work avoidance. It's just like it's a huge multiplier of my personal capability. But I would say there's another discipline you have to learn in addition to paying a lot of attention to what's changing and looking deep at that and trying to understand it, is you also have to continually ask yourself, what part of what I believe may be rendered irrelevant? Right? What part of my assumptions about what industry I'm in, what the customer wants, whatever, what part of that belief system is truly like physics and will never change? And what part of that are just assumptions? I remember I mentioned NBC earlier. This was 2016, so whatever, like 8 or 9 years ago. So here's the guy who was running all of media research for a big television broadcaster, presenting to their advertisers on the future of media. And I'm going to give you, this is like almost a direct quote. I might miss a word or two, but he said this is 2016. He said, Netflix does not have enough interesting content to be relevant, and YouTube is a sidebar. That's 2016. In 2016, if you looked at people between like 18 and 30 something, they're already getting 2/3 of their content through streaming. It was clear where this thing was going. There was no, you could, in fact, I had conversations in the early 1990s with engineers at AT&T who were looking at the growth of broadband into homes, looking at the fact we're getting better and better at video compression. And in the mid-1990s, they predicted that in 2005, you would have full motion video into our homes. There was no question this was going to happen. And yet a whole industry missed this because they could not challenge their own very comfortable preconceptions. So if you want to be an innovator, if you want to make a difference, the first thing you have to challenge is your own preconceived notions. You have to be really, I'm hanging on to this because it makes me feel comfortable or because everybody else believes it. But let me really interrogate this and think about this deeply and ask, like, is there another alternative here? And so, the reason I think companies miss the future is almost never because it was unpredictable, but it's because it was unpalatable. So at the same time, you're worrying about the future and understand these things, be super honest with yourself and ask, like, where am I hanging on to beliefs and assumptions because they make me feel good, because they're comfortable, because I've never taken the time to challenge them, because I haven't looked for disconfirming evidence. And so I just like continue to live, because that, more than any technology, the real threat to any organization is their own unexamined beliefs. I mean, when we work with companies on innovation, and we typically do it with an open platform where, we're engaging thousands of people at the same time. But one of the first things, and I think this is always a starting point for innovation, is to ask, what are our assumptions? Yeah. And how do we challenge those? It's quite interesting. We did some work a few years back with Adidas or Adidas, depending where in the world you are, with their business in North America principally. And it's kind of curious. You go like, okay, so how did you guys miss Lululemon, which is athletic wear, right? And and there's certain days, there's certain months where Lululemon is now worth more than Adidas, which is like this 100-year-old company. Yeah. And so, well, the assumption is if you're at Nike or Adidas or whatever, and somebody says like, well, what is a sport? You go, well, it's men in uniform kicking a ball or something with a referee. And yoga is none of those things, right? But it sure as hell is athletic if you've ever done it, right? It's very demanding. And so you have this whole industry run by 50-something-year-old men who have this particular definition of sports and missed the biggest trend in athletic wear, like in maybe 50 years. So it doesn't have to be that way. So if you develop a discipline, it's not simply, it's literally a discipline, and we have exercises and ways of going through this. But take all of your competitors. In that case, take all the usual suspects and ask yourself, what do you all believe in common? How do you go to market? Who's the customer? How do you develop products, right? How do you price? Take every single point where your business models are similar and overlapping and say, is this truly the only way? And make it, can I imagine an alternative, right? What if women were our primary customer rather than they call it shrink it and pink it, right? Rather than we just like, whatever, like what would be different in our approach if they were our primary customer, right? So that, that's why I think often so many innovation attempts, efforts really don't produce much, because we don't start by deconstructing what we already believe. So the innovation happens within the boundaries of all of our assumptions and what we believe. So for me, the first step, if anybody wants to be innovative, you want to innovate a company, the first step is you have to be super systematic, hardcore about looking at, any belief, any system that has not changed for a decade, that is held in common across your industry. And you got to pressure test the heck out of that and say, like, can we imagine any world in which that might not be true anymore? And then like, let's take that seriously. So on average, what happens in organizations is we dismiss the disconfirming evidence. We don't want to think about it, rather than go like, I think, one of the classic examples here is Paul Otellini when he was running Intel, and he was a succession of like marketing and finance people who were running Intel rather than engineers, which it probably should have been. And Apple comes to him, Steve Jobs comes to him, I guess it must have been 2006, and says, will you make chips for the new iPhone? And Paul Otellini says no, because like we really don't make those kinds of chips. It's kind of technically difficult, and the margins are not going to be as good as selling whatever. So they said no. And of course, that came to haunt them because they missed that, and that becomes the dominant kind of chip design in the world, and they're out of the game, and they're forever out of the game. They're not going to get back in. And later he defended that decision by saying nobody could see how successful the iPhone would be, which is actually not true. There were many people who saw prototypes who understood this is like a huge game changer. I have no doubt that if he would have gone to a couple of dozen young 30-something engineers at Intel and says, guys, does this look like the future to you? Like, tell me like what we should do here. They would have said, hey, we have to go for this thing.
Yeah.
Right. So, he couldn't challenge his own beliefs or assumptions, but there are certainly people in the organization that would have helped him do that if he would have talked to them or listened to them.
Well, that's the OODA loop, Mike, right?
It totally is. I mean, and I think that's a great way to actually end it, Chris. Professor Hamel.
No, I don't want Gary to go.
I know I don't want you to go because it's so interesting, but it's like, be prepared to be unpredictable, test the assumptions, right? I mean, these are things like go to the people who are on the front lines, get their feedback, get their opinion. These are the frontline guys that are on the edge of the, tip of the spear, edge of the cliff. They see things that we don't, right? So I think that's beautiful. Gary, how do people find you? How do they find you and what you do?
So you can find me at garyhamel.com. You can email. I'm happy if people have questions or whatever at garyhamel.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, Prof. Hamel. I'm on X, Prof. Hamel, LinkedIn. So yeah, if you have a question, you want some resources, please come and find me. Always happy to have a conversation.
Well, thank you, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions, great conversation. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it, Gary.
Thank you to our listeners. Stay curious,
Stay powerful, and stay human.
be sure to subscribe to our podcast either on Spotify, Podbean. Leave us a review there as well.
Share this episode with your friends, and check out the Rise of Humanness on YouTube for bonus clips.
Visit our Facebook community, our website, www.itsvukamax.com. All right, guys, we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
The rise of humanness in the age of AI. It's a podcast with Chris and Mike. The rise of humanness in the age of AI. Stay curious, stay human, let's rise.